So in this unit, we're going to look a little bit more internal in the brain. We're going to look at the mid-sagittal surface. So remember, sagittal means it's cutting down so that you get the two cerebral sides, right? The two hemisphere sides. So we're cutting right down the middle. And it's going to basically be a region in the brain that allows for things like the limbic surface. We're going to be looking at the sort of our control center, which is our thalamus. And we'll also look a little bit at the basal ganglia. Remember that when we talk about things that are nuclei, these aren't distinct structures per se. They're regions where a number of neurons share key common features. So the first thing I want to talk to you a little bit about is you walk into your grandma's house and you smell cookies and immediately you feel comforted. This is part of what is called the limbic system. And I should point out a few things here on the slide that are kind of important for you before we talk about what it does with regards to smelling cookies and feeling good, right? So first thing I want to talk to you a little bit about is this corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is a structure that basically connects the left and right cerebral hemispheres. And you can see that up here. I'm going to start outlining in red right here. It's that sort of pinkish area there. Right above it is a region called the cingulate gyrus. This is a part of the limbic system. There are also associated structures in this limbic system, like the basal nuclei, which I'll show you in a second, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and your sense of smell, right, your olfactory cortex. And they are involved in memory, reproduction, and nutrition. And it's, again, that emotional interpretation of sensory input. You have some kind of a smell and you feel something. There's a feeling associated with that. In the last slide, I just told you that part of the reason that limbic system is there to help control things like reproduction, nutrition, and memory. So let's look at the structures here again. So now we're looking at a mid-sagittal view of the human brain. On the outside here in part B, you can see in green, blue, and red, these are the lobes, right? The frontal, the occipital, and the temporal lobe. And then here, located right at the base of the brain stem, here is the cerebellum, one side of it, right? And inside in the middle here, we have the ventricle, which we'll talk more about in the next part of the lectures here, G4. And then we can see that there's that structure, the corpus callosum, that connects the two cerebral hemispheres. And we're going to see a number of structures right in the center here. That's the one we're going to spend some time on. And so we're going to come down here and look at them. Why? Because they're important for things like reproduction. So let's look at some of those structures and their associations, right? So you've heard of the hypothalamus right before, and hypo meaning below. So the thalamus is going to be right in the center of this structure here, and anything that's below it is going to be hypo. So this is the hypothalamic structure. The epithalamus up here, the pineal gland, and we're going to see some other structures that are associated. Here's a corpora quadrigemina back here. Okay, here's our cerebellum down here, just to give you context of where we're located here. And then the ventricles are going to serve to put solutions, namely the cerebrospinal fluid, down a pathway that I'm drawing for you right now. That's going to kind of bathe all of these structures with the cerebrospinal fluid, but also it's going to give them things that are very important for keeping them sustained and remove things from them as well that are important. We'll talk a little bit more about all these structures in the upcoming slides. So let's look a little closer. Again, let's come back here. Here's our corpora quadrigemina that I'm drawing a circle around. The two upper, so there's one on each side, are the superior colliculi, part of the corpora quadrigemina. These are for vision. And the two lower ones here are going to be for hearing. These are the inferior colliculi. Let's give our reference points here. Here's our corpus callosum connecting our two cerebral hemispheres. Here's a ventricle that I'll talk more about in the next lecture. Here's our thalamus in the middle. Here's our hypothalamus down here, and our pituitary gland, which will be right down here. And we'll have our epithalamus, or our pineal gland, up here. We'll see that there's fluids that then come from the ventricles in between all of these. These are cerebrospinal fluid, and very important. I'll talk about what those are in a minute here. If we look at a superior view and we cut down into the brain, doing sort of a mid-sagittal section here, you're going to see a structure that looks like a seahorse here. This is the hippocampus, and it's part of that limbic system we just talked about. It plays a role in spatial navigation, memory, emotions, and then the fornix connects that hippocampus to the hypothalamus. And we'll talk about why that's important coming up. This is looking at the thalamus. We call this central station. So all the information that's coming up through the spinal cord comes through the brain stem. It feeds up around that pons up towards the midbrain. And as we get here, here's that thalamus that we just talked about. Thalamus is kind of like a giant yo-yo. There's two halves that are connected by something called the interthalamic adhesion. And that interthalamic adhesion is very important. It connects the two halves of the thalamus. The thalamus itself is our integration or relay center for all sensory and motor function. I've talked about this a number of times. Incredibly important region. All sensory input that reaches the cerebrum, except some senses of smell, come through this region here. And then they're branched out to where they're sort of interpreted in the parts of the brain or the cerebrum. And then it's also important to note that emotions and pain perception are related through these regions. I kind of want to talk a little bit about the idea that each of these has a different region and name. So there's the ventral posterior lateral, so the VPL. There's the ventral lateral, the VL. There's the ventral posterior medial, the VPM. And then the pulvinar, and the medial geniculate nucleus, and the lateral geniculate nucleus. And I know you're saying to yourself, that's a lot to remember, but every single one of these is going to be a part of a large lecture that we're going to talk about when we start talking about special senses and some of the functions that are interpreted by these. And all of the incoming neurons are kind of fed to these regions to kind of help spatially keep all the neurons of different types of function apart from each other and organized. So again, this is like central station where all incoming sensory information is going up towards, in ascending tracks towards the brain, and then all the descending tracks that now are interpreted are going to come back down through here in most cases for motor function back through the spinal cord and innervate the particular nerves to the tissues, the muscles, and the glands that they innervate. So remember, the thalamus is feeding information up to our cerebral cortex. And there's actually 6 layers of the cerebral cortex. Kind of big picture is to note that if you look above here, you can see those 6 layers. We're going to focus in on something called the thalamocortical connections. And that's the idea that as things emanate from the thalamus, they will connect through a neuron to their regions of the cortex. And you can see up here at each of these layers, there's different architecture based on the types of cells that are found in each region of the cerebral cortex. And in fact, each of these is referred to as an individual layer. So we can see that these different structures, if you looked at them morphologically, they each have different structures, and they've been identified as distinct layers of the cerebrum or the cerebral cortex. Now, it's important to note that most sensory information that's coming in through these, remember, thalamo means that's where it's coming from. Cortical means where it's going to. So thalamocortical means it's moving up to the layer 4, the mid layer of the cerebrum or the cerebral cortex. And then that information would then feed up to other regions. It's also important to note that there are a lot of other connections that happen in the thalamus. And then we move from the cortical thalamico, and those structures are going to move then from the cortex in a motor function back down again. And we'll spend some time looking at those descending tracks, typically layers 5 and 6 down here. So we'll spend a lot more time on this later on. I just wanted to kind of give you a big picture view of that a little bit early, and then you'll see this a little bit later on again. It's not important to note all the details yet, but there is a large amount of information about this in your textbook. This is looking at some of the coronal section structures. So in C, let's just look at C first. So let's imagine that we're doing sections through the brain, and you can see there's 2 sections here, and those 2 sections are what we see in A and in B over here. And what you can see is some of these structures that we talked a little bit about that are important in basically the ganglia, which are learning and memory, or the amygdala, which is important in process, memory, and sort of stranger danger, or sort of like that sort of fear processing. And so the idea is that if you look at some of these structures in that coronal section, think again about cutting off the nose, right, and just keeping going back, we're going to see structures. Here's the corpus callosum separating or connecting, our two cerebral hemispheres. Here's one cerebral hemisphere over here. Here's another cerebral hemisphere over here. You can see the white matter and the gray matter more on the outside. You'll also see that there are not a number of structures, like the amygdala, for instance, down here. Okay. And you can see structures like the mammillary body over here, which are important. And we'll spend a little bit of time talking about a number of these. This is the one I want to focus our energy on a little bit more here. This is the basal ganglia. There's the caudate, the putamen, and the globus pallidus. These are nuclei regions that are important as in addition to the substantia nigra and also the subthalamic nuclei that are important for learning, memory, and some motor function.